Hello, and thanks for opening up the toolkit. I'm Justin Fortier, the host. Today, I'm talking with Patrick Mehr, the publisher at Plunkett Lake Press. Now, he started as a digital publisher in his retirement, where he takes old, interesting books and makes Kindle versions out of them. Also distributes on the other platforms, as he'll explain. I ended up finding him when I was looking for a copy of this book about manufacturing called From the American System to Mass Production, and realized that the first time I had looked to buy this book, there's no Kindle, and then one was added. And I was wondering why a book published so long ago had finally capitulated and brought their ebook online. And sure enough, I saw a note about his publishing firm. Before that, he was a consultant. He'll touch on his background there. But if this is your first time listening to my podcast, The Toolkit, you can find us on all podcast platforms, hopefully, and YouTube at The Toolkit. And I really just interview people that I find interesting. Without further ado, let's get to the interview. All right. Thank you, Patrick, for joining. I appreciate you taking the time to do this today. I actually came across you with this book written by David Hounshell, a Carnegie Mellon professor that had written a book from the American system to mass production, and it used to not be on Kindle. And then within the last a year, it was on Kindle. Then I checked out the publisher because there was a note, an author's note at the beginning talking about the digital reprint. And I went to your site and I saw you did it for a whole bunch of old books that looked really interesting to me. So I wondered, who's doing this? One of my favorite things to do online is to go to a site called archive.org or go into like newspapers.com and look at old things. But that's not as easy to do as going to Amazon and clicking buy. I'd love to talk with you about digital publishing and how you got into this.
Excellent. I'm glad I'm here because I hope you will recommend to me many other books like the David Hounshell that are not yet available as ebooks that should become ebooks. And assuming you have similar interests to mine, then they might become, if I can get the electronic rights from whoever now controls them, they might, just like the David Hounshell book, also become Plunkett Lake Press ebooks and be available on Amazon Kindle, Apple Books, Google Play, Kobo, and Nook, which are the 5 distribution channels that I use. So to give you a little bit of background, I was born, grew up, and was educated in France. I went to basically the equivalent of MIT there and did a lot of mathematics, physics, etc. And then, as often happens in France for people who are good at calculus, they end up being technocrats in the government as opposed to inventing the next Google, unfortunately. And so that's what I did. But I always had an interest in industrial issues and science in general and new discoveries, etc. And so I moved to Massachusetts 42 years ago now, where my wife also lives. My wife happens to be an author, quite well known. And she also happened 20 years ago to have posted on Amazon what Amazon at the time called Amazon Shorts, which were up to 5,000 or so word pieces, which they made available as PDFs for $1.99 or $2.99 or some small amount of that sort. And one day my wife received an email from Amazon saying, we're discontinuing this program, but if you we can help you turn those things into ebooks. Now, my wife is a bit of the opposite of me, namely she doesn't really follow technology, nor is she too interested in it. So she immediately forwarded it to me. And even though I was not at the time a great reader, I did follow the technology of ebooks because I thought that's something interesting. This is literally, I believe now, 15 to 20 years ago. And so I looked into what Amazon was proposing to do. And I said, gee, I can do that. Why wouldn't I do this for all of my wife's short pieces and for her major books, assuming that she had kept the electronic rights? And sure enough, her agents had been smart enough over time to indeed retain the electronic rights. And so that's how I started Plunkett Lake Press, frankly, as a hobby, because that was just about the time when I stopped working as a management consultant doing strategy for technology-based companies and decided to do this, at least for a few titles. That's also the time when I realized that as a technocrat in France and as a business consultant here in the US, working in very obscure fields like semiconductor testing and so forth. I never really had time to read books that interest me. And so one thing led to the next, and including several author friends of my wife's who had written various books of nonfiction. One that comes to mind is a biography of Marie Curie. And so I started, when I was done with my wife's books, to digitize those books as well. And so Plunkett Lake Press started with 5 or 6 titles and now is up to 340. This is basically an opportunity for me to read very carefully. And if you're interested, I can explain to you why, but very carefully, books that interest me that have not yet been turned into ebooks by anybody, mainly for 2 reasons. First of all, because they first appeared as physical books well before ebooks existed. And second, because they're so intelligent and well written that they're not like your pop star's memoir and do not have a wide market. And therefore, conventional publishers such as Random House, etc., do not see any economic value in turning a book that's moreover out of print, backlist title into an ebook. And so that's when I get involved. So that's what Plunkett Lake Press does. So the focus is really on the areas of interest to me, which is, by the way, strictly nonfiction. There's no fiction whatsoever on my list. So there are lots of biographies, memoirs, books by and about scientists or technology, such as the book that caught your attention. And then books about history of the United States, European countries, books about Jews, because I happen to be Jewish. And so that's pretty much it.
I was amazed to find your work because it's something I've been thinking about quite a bit. I'm currently also a management consultant, slightly less niche, but for industrial companies like automotive suppliers and things like that.
We're getting a Rivian in exactly 4 days. So as a
Oh,
normal,
yes, a wonderful vehicle. I've gotten a chance to ride in a few of them recently and work for some suppliers making some parts there. So,
if you think
uh,
its battery works very well, you should know that my older son is the engineering manager on the LFP battery on that vehicle. So
oh, that's
we can talk
fantastic.
about vehicles as well. Keep going.
I, it's incredible. But one of the things that has sent me down this path into reading old books and often being disappointed by a Kindle version not being present i- or an Audible version, which is another thing I mentioned to you before we started that I've really enjoyed podcasts because it's a great way for me to listen to either an audiobook or something that sparks my curiosity while I'm doing chores or something else. And I've been really exploring the industrial history of Connecticut, where I grew up, and the transformation that occurred. Actually, the book that I found you through mentions a town called Collinsville, which this man named Elijah Root worked in, and he built this axe factory, and then he went to Colt's Armory. And so I've been exploring tons of these old books, but Kindles have this amazing feature where you can just search for a word, which makes research and writing and reflecting and going back much easier, especially with I'm often traveling to other states and things like that. So being able to carry a book with me is amazing. And I've recently been exploring. New York has great libraries, but there's so many wonderful books that I'm not sure how they make that transition or how people find them in the future. I actually can't imagine what research was like 50 years ago. But how do you find a great title? Do you have a library that you start with and you're just exploring and then you check when you read a great book? Tell me a little bit about your discovery process.
My main source is people like you. I like to receive suggestions from people who will tell me, hey, Patrick, I know of this book. It's available on Amazon as a used book for $552, which is ridiculous. Would you turn it into an ebook? To be candid, that's not my main source because I wish there were more people like you and me who are interested in these kinds of things. But please keep me in mind now that you know the areas of interest on the PlunkettLakePress.com website. There's a list of categories of books. And as you peruse that, you get a very clear sense of the types of topics that are of interest to me. I would say the main source are the footnotes that cite other books. For example, I just published yesterday a massive history of the CIA called The Agency by John Randlag. Not only is it massive, but more importantly, it's extremely intelligent in the sense that it doesn't give you thriller stories like you'd see in the movies. It discusses issues such as, is human intelligence more or less important than analysis? Is human intelligence more or less important than technological intelligence, such as satellite photography or infrared photography and so forth, or listening in on communications of other nations and so forth? Or should the CIA be at the service of the president or be independent, et cetera, et cetera? And it goes over the history since the OSS in 1947 up to the date when the book was published, which was in the late 1980s. And so that book has something like 1,600 footnotes. And among those are memoirs by specific agents, for example, by the CIA agent whose name is Kermit Roosevelt. He's the grandson of Teddy Roosevelt, who basically organized the coup against the communist prime minister of Iran, Mossadegh, that brought to power the Shah of Iran. So I had no idea that Kermit Roosevelt had been involved in this, let alone that he wrote a memoir. And so I then go to our local library, which happens to be extraordinarily endowed with lots of books and which has access to all sorts of academic libraries. And I now have the book on my shelf right next to me here. And I look at it, decide whether or not I'm interested. And if I am, I then need to secure what's called the electronic rights, which means permission to publish the book as an ebook. And that typically belongs either to the publisher of the book, which in this case is McGraw-Hill from literally 5 decades ago or so, 4 decades ago. So if they have the rights, they very likely do not care to license them to me. But very often the rights have, as we say in the publishing business, reverted to the author or to, in this case, his estate. And then I have to locate the estate of the author, which requires quite a bit of research, especially if the author's last name is Fortier, as you would know. With a name like Roosevelt, it may be a little bit easier, but not automatically. And that happens to be a skill that I have in droves, simply because I used to be a consultant with the Boston Consulting Group. And so I do know how to do research. And so once I obtain the rights, the typical arrangement is that I will digitize the book at my own expense on my own time. And once the book is published on the 5 channels I mentioned, I will return 25% of the revenues I get from Amazon, Apple, etc., to the owner of the electronic rights in exchange for having granted me those electronic rights. So that's how the process works. But again, it's really important for me to have the word out there and to ask people to contact me. There is a contact page on our website, Plunkett Lake Press, in one word.com. That's PLUNKETTPRESS.com. And so people can suggest titles and I will look at them just like I described for this book about this CIA operation in Iran and decide whether or not I want to do the book and whether or not I can obtain the electronic rights.
One thing about those rights that is interesting for me, at least, I remember flipping through this book. It's called Machines That Built America. And I was looking at the
Writing
publisher.
it right now. Machines That Built America.
Yeah, it's by Roger Burlingame. I think it was written for high school students or middle school. But it's an interesting, delightful history. I have a few old copies. But one thing about the publishing industry, much like a lot of media industries, it seems like there's been so many consolidations over time that it was hard to tell what publishing house. I'm sure you've built up a very unique set of skills to track down who the ultimate rights holder is because I just typing in the first publisher, it looked like that had been long gone and been swallowed up by another one, which had been swallowed up by another. And much, even music labels do this too, where they might have some sub brand that is the imprint that they're using to market this at one time. It seems like a pretty daunting task.
It's part of the job. You're right. Finding a publisher when the company has been absorbed several times is sometimes challenging. Finding the estate of an author whose last name is not uncommon. And then finding, in the case of translators, finding where they are and or if they're deceased, who their estate is also very daunting, because in the case of translations, one needs to also secure the rights to use that translation for an ebook edition.
Interesting. Yeah, and for most of these, when the book hasn't been published for a while, I assume they haven't been receiving checks for a while, so they're not really looking out for communication, right? Are they often surprised to
Yes,
hear what's the reaction?
absolutely. In several such situations, I have helped the estate of a deceased author recover some money from a publisher who had lost track of that estate. I, I will say, from my experience, that I think I'm better at finding estates of deceased authors than even Random House. The reason being that it's frankly not in Random House's interest to chase an estate if nobody asks them, where are my royalties for XYZ book from my great grandfather, who's now deceased, of course. Whereas in my case, I have to find the estate, otherwise I can't publish the ebook.
Yeah, is it 75 years after death? I know this is probably a Googleable fact, but
No,
how long?
it's much more complex than that. The copyright laws have changed, and a book goes into public domain a number of years after either publication date or death of the author, depending on when it was first published in the United States. Cornell University has a very good website which takes you through all the hypotheses in terms of publication date, when did the author die, etc. So I would really not quote anything because it wouldn't be
Mhm.
correct for the next book you want to look at. You have to go to this Cornell University copyright webpage, which is very well documented, to find out about the specifics for each book.
Have you ever done books that were just already in the public domain and done them, or is that already swallowed up by different publishers?
I've done a few, again, some that are very popular or for the very general broad public have already been published, sometime by what I would call junkie type presses, some based in China, etc. But for much more serious books, for example, Bernard Baruch, who was one of the advisors of FDR during the war, and even during the First World War, about industrial mobilization, wrote his autobiography in 2 volumes. And it turns out that one of them, because of the publication date and everything I was just describing to you a few minutes ago, is in the public domain and nobody digitized it. So I did digitize it, but I was not able, unfortunately, to obtain the rights to the second volume. So I have only one of those 2 volumes. Another example that comes to mind is Léon Blum, who was prime minister in France, wrote something called, in French, it's a French book, and I have a few French titles because obviously I speak French and can do all the editing. In French, he called something called Souvenir sur l'affaire, which basically means remembrances about the affair being the Dreyfus affair. And so it's a very personal, interesting analysis of what, from his perspective, as after the fact, having become France's prime minister, he saw as being the driving forces of what caused the Dreyfus affair to happen in France. And so that book, simply because it's so old, is in the public domain, and no French publisher cared to digitize it. So it's now a Plunkett Lake Press ebook.
One last thing on securing the rights. Is the most often case when you can't obtain it is that you can't locate the holder? Are there ever situations where people are just done with having their book exist? Are people ever apprehensive about an ebook if for other reasons?
The reasons for my not being able to obtain the rights vary. I could give you percentages off the top of my head, but I don't think it's so important. In some cases, maybe I would say 20% or so, I cannot find the estate. Most often because the name is so common, it's just very difficult. And then I would say there's another 20% where, without trying to be obnoxious to anybody, but the descendants are simply weird. And so they will say, no, thank you. And I will keep saying, why not? My wife is an author. If somebody had some way of making her books more available, she'd be delighted. Why would you not let me do an ebook since somebody else on the planet that I can think of would do that, especially at no cost to you? And I just don't get any rational answer. Another 20%, and I have a particular person in California in mind, basically takes forever to decide. Some people have psychological problems and they just need to research this and research that, and et cetera, et cetera. So that happens. So that's 60%. And I would say the other 40% are something like the e-rights technically belong to a major publisher. And some major publishers will do one of two things. And I frankly don't believe either to be true, or to be, I should say, economically well-founded. One, they will say, oh, we never license rights because it's too complicated. And so I'm working right now with some lawyers, hopefully, to figure out whether it's acceptable that a major company sits on rights without exploiting them. I'm told, but I'm not a lawyer and I haven't researched it yet, that it's just not okay to do that. They have to relinquish the rights back to whoever granted them those rights, which is typically the author of the book. And then I could deal with the author of the book. The other thing that some major publishers will do, and I have a few specific ones in mind, which I will not name, they will say, oh, we have our own program to digitize this book. At which point I will say, great, when do you expect to have it out? So they will tell me, oh, within the next 2 years. So I have specific titles I could cite to you in my database for which I heard this 8 years ago. And there's still no ebook. My point being that these companies have backlists of tens of thousands of books to digitize. And it's frankly not economical for them to do it. I do it basically as a hobby. So to me, it doesn't matter as long as I'm really interested in the subject matter. Yet they will not relinquish those e-rights because they claim that they will get to that. And if the author in the original contract, or which is even more annoying to be, through an amendment, which recently those large publishers asked the author to sign, they signed away the e-rights without saying, I want my book to be an ebook within the next 24 months or whatever amount of time, then basically those e-rights are frozen and remain the property of that publisher, and I cannot publish the ebook. And frankly, sometimes I try to explain that to the estate or to the author, if the author is still alive. And sometimes the author will fight and it works. And sometimes the author or the estate basically don't care as much as I do, and nothing will happen.
Got it. That makes sense. What's your favorite part and most challenging part of actually turning it into a digital book?
Frankly, I love the whole process. That's a tough question for me to answer clearly. I happen to be an extremely meticulous person. So the physical process of digitizing the book and of finding typos literally in every book, be it from the most prestigious publishers like Knopf or Random House, all the way down to the smallest university press, is just fascinating to me. And I show my authors and our rights grantors that the ebook edition is in fact cleaner than the original. So that's fun. Finding the estates is fun because you get a sense of what the children or grandchildren of some of the people were extremely famous in their own time. And so here I am talking to the grandson of a Nobel Prize winner in physics or of a former high executive in the CIA, etc. And so it's interesting to see what happens to their descendants. I would say the most frustrating part is to be told no by the large publisher when I ask them for the e-rights, which I explained to you just a few minutes ago, happens especially from certain publishers. And so I'm working right now to try and sort that legal issue out in a way that I don't plan to take anybody to court, frankly. It would be too costly, and that's not my style of operating. But it seems to me that if I can find a clear citation of why it's not okay to keep rights that one doesn't exploit, then hopefully that will crack that nut.
That would be an amazing win to accomplish. One interesting business of the financial technology company payment processing Stripe, they they opened their own press several years ago to publish new books, but also one of the books I think they put out in the last year was one of those books on Amazon that was several $100s for a used copy. It was Poor Charlie's Almanac about Charlie Munger, the investor. And I thought, what an amazing service to do that. I'm sure it's also, they are probably selling lots of copies.
By the way, that's the other great satisfaction I take out of doing this. Two things you remind me to mention here. One is I get to read these books. I happen to be the kind of person who has a hard time sitting in an armchair around a pool with a cocktail in my hand reading a book for pleasure. I feel like I'm wasting my time. So in this case, I read the books extremely closely to find all these typos. Basically means cleaning up the digital file that gets produced in the various steps of the digitizing process. So that's one satisfaction to get to read those books. But then the one that I really want to mention is that all of my ebooks are priced at $9.99. So all of a sudden, the used book that would cost hundreds of dollars for no good reason, except that the seller thinks he or she can get a few $100s for that rare copy of a used book, all of a sudden is available for $9.99. So I feel that's a huge service, even for used copies that may be only $20, because if the book is in the US and you sit in Australia or some faraway place and you order that book, it'll take a month to get there. You'll pay another $20 or $30 of shipping fees, whereas my Plunkett Lake Press ebook gets downloaded in 60 seconds for $9.99.
That's amazing. You were talking about those footnotes is where you often find them. And that's such a satisfying part about digital books is that if you do go in a footnote and you're having a moment, you're in a chapter and something's being referenced, and suddenly you're excited to do that. It's nice to be able to follow that curiosity immediately
Right.
rather than being like, it's going to come from thrift books at some point. Obviously, I'm very grateful these booksellers exist, but when I can go into the digital one and pick out just that section maybe to get the detail or the context, that's so satisfying. So thank you for your work. And the pricing, I see so many ebooks priced at that. Is that just the standard one that makes sense? Did you think at all about pricing when you started, or is that just the industry default?
I can't give you a broad supported answer. I can give you the concrete answer, which is that, and by the way, about 80% of the ebooks of all 340 titles that I now have sell on Amazon Kindle. And Amazon Kindle has several portals to deal with several types of publishers. I don't know how they deal with a Knopf for Random House, but it's not the same portal that I use. The one I use is called KDP, which stands for Kindle Direct Publishing. And they make you sign a contract. And one of the clauses in the contract is that to get 70% back from the retail price as a publisher, we have to price it up to $9.99. So they just won't allow me to price above $9.99. Now, again, I don't have a major problem with that because it does make the books available to students in particular at what I consider to be a very affordable price. When I found some Routledge, for example, books that are ebooks that are priced at $69.99, I find it outrageous because obviously, just like for Plunkett Lake Press, all Routledge did is to upload to some cloud a digital file, and once it's there, it costs them nothing to download it. So I think $9.99 is a very fair price,
It
especially
is.
since many of the ebooks that Plunkett Lake Press sells, because they're very obscure, will sell fewer than a dozen or two copies a year. And so I couldn't sell them for $1.99. That wouldn't allow me to even pay for my time. But $9.99, I think, is a very fair price.
Are you ever so fortunate when you reach out and get the rights permission that they have digital copies already? Almost all these books were written before a digital word processor, right? So are you just working straight off of the finished published book, or is there anything else that you ever receive that aids in your process?
No, I always work off of a physical copy, which I guillotine, means I make the pages loose, and then I feed the pages into a desktop a scanner that scans both sides of each page in one pass. And then there is optical character recognition. So for a book of 400 pages, like I digitized this morning, this whole process takes literally less than 45 minutes. Most people would think, oh, great, then you're ready to publish. But that's not the case. Then starts the hard work. A fiber in the paper may translate into a random comma or period that appears anywhere in the text of the digital file, or the word close, CLOSE, printed. If the typeface and font is such that the C and the L are very close to each other, it will turn into the word dose, DOSE, which is also an English word. And so what happens after the 45 minutes of scanning and OCR, optical character recognition, is that I sit with a copy of the book on my lap, and I have my computer through text to speech speak out the digital file, which I have also cleaned up through mass cleanings. If I find an apostrophe that's preceded by a space and followed by a space, that's obviously not legitimate. You want an apostrophe to be after a letter, or if it's an English book and it's the equivalent of an American quotation mark, you want it before a letter. So I do all sorts of mass cleanings of that sort. And once I have the cleanest possible file, then I have my computer speak it to me through text to speech. And that's when I find either typos or quotation marks that are missing in the original book, or all sorts of strange things that I then correct. And that will take, for a book of, say, 400 pages, a good 2 weeks of my life. And to answer your question, I wouldn't, having a digital file that an author or a publisher may have had from when the book was first published would not help me much. It would save me only 45 minutes of work, plus would create all sorts of technological issues because a PDF may not like my word processor or vice versa. And so to avoid all of this, I'd rather buy a used copy and then do everything I just described to you.
Thank you. I've played around with some of the technology and have experienced something quite similar. Rhode Island, in particular. There was this old document talking about the American Revolution, and Rhode Island kept being written 6 different ways. Sometimes it was Boat Island code, all of the different ways. The certain font type of whatever the original publisher was, the more flamboyant, perhaps, the more difficult the OCR was struggling to digitize that.
To speak of the fact that many of the books I digitize have words in foreign languages in the original English. So words in German or Spanish or French. And so of course, the OCR has a hard time figuring out whether or not it's a foreign language word or whether it's something that the software doesn't know how to recognize.
Have you played with a few different technology providers for that OCR, and you found one that to be more accurate than others? Because I know that it's been around for a while, and some are very immature, and some seem to deliver better results.
I'm very pleased with the system I use now, so I frankly haven't been looking for anything else.
At the beginning, you mentioned that you didn't get to read a lot of these books. Is 2 weeks is sounds like a pretty intense stretch, but you've added, you said 340 titles, and is it what's been your favorite subject you've explored? I think we can maybe wrap up with this, but is there any avenue, or nowadays a lot of people say rabbit hole, talking about going through the footnotes and continuing to follow something. Has there been any thread that you've really weren't expecting to, or you feel like is particularly niche but has been delightful for you?
Well, first I should clarify that when my computer reads the cleanest digital file I've created, to me, it even reads the punctuation because I turn every comma into the word comma. If I take a random page I'm working on right now, it will say, in the USA, he contained, period, new paragraph. The principal ingredient of such agitation continues to be hatred of foreigners, colon. wherever neo-fascist appear, dash, whether in England, comma, France, comma. So I discovered, because I worked with some people who wanted to learn the skills and the tricks of this, that it turns out some people's brains are organized in such a way that they're distracted by the new paragraph, period, comma, dash, etc., or quotes or apostrophe, etc. I am not. I don't know whether I trained myself after 340 of these or whether it's natural, but my point is that's in part why it takes 2 weeks to be read to really a 400-page book. That's number one. Number two, I am the kind of person for whom it's a lot easier to absorb things through my ears. And so because I sit there and I have the written text and I can look at it, and then through my ears, I get not only the text, but also the comma, semicolon, etc. I really understand the book in great depth, and that's very satisfying. This activity of mine in my retirement really is some kind of adult education for me, and that's, I would say, the most enjoyable part of the whole thing. Now, to more specifically address your question, I think the areas that interest me are the ones that you can find on the PlunkettLakePress.com under categories, and they have to do with American history, European history, military history, science and scientists, biographies, and memoirs. Those would be the main topics, I would say.
Thank you very much. And I too do appreciate when I can listen and read at the same time. Amazon does have a built-in reader on their Kindle, which I use sometimes with a very automated voice. But my favorite feature, which is definitely not on every title, that has both a Kindle book and one with a Audible, the audiobook company they own, narration. But some of them have what's called Whisper Sync, which is great, where you hear a voice actor reading the book. It lines up with the text, and that's nirvana for me. But thank you so much. It's been an honor to talk to you. I really enjoy hearing about amazing projects you've been on, and it's so cool to me. So thank you very much,
I
Patrick.
look forward to many book suggestions from you of titles that should be digitized into ebooks.
Thank you for making it to the end, and I'm really glad Patrick came on to chat with me. I found it interesting. I think there's so much opportunity to take old wisdom books and get them into electronic forms. Something I've been playing around with that I hinted at is turning old books into personal audiobooks. I don't spend time to get the rights, so I can't publish them, but maybe that's something I'll do in the future. I think it's amazing to get a perspective from the past. As somebody who grew up listening to public radio and audiobooks and starting to read a lot of first what my grandfather gave me, but then you start to pick up books based on what has the nice cover or what's in the airport shelf or what's new in the library. And I've really been enjoying just the depth that books in these niches can offer. So if you're thinking about reading an old book, I encourage you to go check out archive.org. It's an amazing set of archived old books. Some of them, if it's still within copyright, you can just borrow them online for an hour at a time. But if it's 200 years old, you can just view it. You can download the PDF. It's been fascinating. I've been totally digging into the manufacturing history of Connecticut and all the innovations that spread out from those early founders, and it's been awesome. Anyway, thanks for listening. I appreciate it. If you want to find me, I'm at Justin P. Fortier on X or Twitter, whatever you want to call it. And if you want to find my email, you can go to toolkit.fm. My website's a mess right now, but I think there's some more info there. You can also find old podcast episodes and reach out. My messages are open. Awesome. Thank you. Bye.